3 weeks before my son's college graduation. He walked into my workshop carrying a folder and said 7 words I would spend months wishing I'd questioned. "Dad, I just need your signature here." I didn't read the form. I didn't ask why my name was printed at the top. I didn't even take off my work gloves. I just smiled, signed where he pointed, and handed the pen back. Because this was my son, the same boy I'd raised after his mother left our lives. The same boy I'd worked 12-hour days to put through college. The same boy I trusted enough to eventually inherit everything I'd spent nearly 30 years building. At least, that's what I thought. 5 months later, I came home on a rainy Thursday evening and found a certified letter waiting in my mailbox. I almost left it there. Then I saw the name printed beneath mine. Carter and Wells Property Holdings. I never heard of them, but they apparently knew me very well. I opened the envelope standing in my kitchen. By the time I reached the second paragraph, I had to sit down. The document I'd signed before my son's graduation wasn't routine college paperwork. It was connected to my business, my property, and the workshop I'd built from nothing almost 30 years earlier. But the sentence that truly broke me wasn't about what I'd signed. It was about who had prepared the paperwork. Because my son's name wasn't anywhere on it as the author. Someone else had planned the whole thing. And when I called my son and asked him one simple question, "Ethan, what did you make me sign?" There was silence on the other end. Then my son whispered, "Dad, I need to tell you something about Claire." Claire was his fiancée. And suddenly, I knew this was much bigger than one signature. My name is Robert Hayes, but everyone who's known me longer than 5 minutes calls me Rob. I'm 55 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've measured time by the sound of a workshop door opening at 7 in the morning. Hayes Custom Woodworks started with one borrowed table saw in a rented garage outside Columbus, Ohio. I was 26. I had almost no money, no employees, and no idea whether the business would survive its first year. But I had something worth working for. My son, Ethan. When Ethan was 9, his mother left our lives. After that, it was mostly the two of us. I packed his lunches before work. I sat through parent-teacher conferences, still wearing sawdust on my boots. I learned how to cook 5 decent meals because neither of us could survive on takeout forever. And every Saturday morning, Ethan came to the workshop with me. He used to sit on an upside-down bucket and watch me work. When he was 12, he asked me something I've never forgotten. "Dad, why do you work so much?" I pointed around that little shop and told him, "Because someday I want you to have choices I didn't have." Over the years, that rented garage became a real business. I bought a small commercial building, then the lot beside it. I hired employees. We started making custom furniture for restaurants, offices, and private homes across the state. I never became rich, but I built something solid, something with my name on the front. And somewhere along the way, I started thinking of it as Ethan's future too. Then, during his final year of college, Ethan introduced me to Claire Bennett. Claire was smart, polished, confident. She remembered people's names. She asked questions about my business. She laughed at my terrible jokes. And most importantly, Ethan looked happy around her. So I liked her. Maybe I wanted to like her. There's a difference. The first strange moment happened over dinner about 2 months before graduation. Claire asked me whether I owned the workshop building or leased it. I told her I owned it. Then she asked whether the neighboring lot was part of the same property. I laughed. "You planning to buy me out?" She smiled. "No, Ethan talks about this place all the time. I'm just curious." I thought nothing of it. A week later, she asked whether Ethan would eventually take over the company. Again, I answered without hesitation. "If he wants it someday." Claire looked at Ethan. He didn't say anything. At the time, I thought he was embarrassed. Now I know that silence meant something else. 3 weeks before graduation, Ethan came into the workshop around closing time. He had a blue folder tucked under his arm. I was finishing an order and barely looked up. "What's that?" I asked. "Just some paperwork I need finished before graduation." He opened the folder and placed a page in front of me. There were several paragraphs of small print. My name was at the top, and there was a yellow tab beside a signature line. "What's this part for?" Ethan hesitated, only for a second, but he hesitated. Then he said, "It's connected to some financial paperwork I'm getting organized before graduation. Claire's helping me with it." That should have made me stop. Instead, I smiled. "Look at you, finally becoming responsible." Ethan didn't smile back. He just handed me the pen. I signed. He immediately closed the folder. And as he turned toward the door, I noticed something written in the bottom corner. 3 initials. DBB. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't ask. 5 months later, sitting at my kitchen table with that certified letter shaking in my hands, I would see those same 3 initials again. Except this time, they weren't initials. They were part of a name. D.B. Bennett. And Bennett was Claire's last name. I read the certified letter 3 times. Each time, I understood a little more. And each time, I felt worse. The letter referred to a property interest agreement involving the commercial building where Hayes Custom Woodworks operated and the neighboring lot I'd purchased 11 years earlier. Those 2 pieces of property were worth more than anything else I owned. Not because of what some appraiser might put on paper, because I'd spent almost 30 years building my life there. I kept reading until one sentence stopped me cold. It referenced an agreement bearing my signature. My signature, dated 3 weeks before Ethan's graduation. I immediately thought about the blue folder, the yellow tab, the pen Ethan had handed me, and those initials I'd barely noticed. DBB. At the bottom of the letter was a contact name, Douglas B. Bennett, Claire's father. I'd met Douglas twice. The first time was at dinner. He was in his late 50s, always perfectly dressed, with the kind of confidence that made every conversation feel like a negotiation. Claire had introduced him as a business consultant who worked with property investors. That suddenly sounded very different. I grabbed my phone and called Ethan. He answered on the 4th ring. Hey, Dad. Ethan, what did you make me sign before graduation? Silence. Dad, don't tell me it was financial paperwork. I'm holding a letter about my property. Another silence. Then he said the words I'd been afraid to hear. Dad, I need to tell you something about Claire. My stomach tightened. What about her? She told me the form was only supposed to help us. Help you do what? Ethan's voice dropped. Buy a house. I almost laughed because it made so little sense. What does my workshop have to do with you buying a house? I didn't know it involved the workshop. That answer hurt more than I expected. You handed me the document. I know. You watched me sign it. I know. You told me it was routine paperwork. I know, Dad. Every answer was quieter than the one before it. I wanted to yell. Instead, I asked him something much simpler. Did you read it? Ethan didn't answer. And that was my answer. He had trusted Claire. I had trusted him. And somewhere in that chain of trust, someone had known exactly what they were doing. Come to the house, I said. Dad, Claire's here. Then come alone. 25 minutes later, Ethan walked into my kitchen looking nothing like the confident young man I'd watched cross a graduation stage 5 months earlier. He looked scared. I placed the certified letter between us. Start talking. Ethan stared at it. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. There are messages you need to see. Between you and Claire? He shook his head. Between Claire and her father. He opened a series of screenshots. Most were about property values, financing, and something called redevelopment potential. Then I saw my address. My workshop address. Douglas had sent it to Claire months before Ethan ever brought that blue folder into my shop. Underneath it, Claire had written, "He'll never agree to sell." Douglas responded, "Then selling can't be the first step." I felt my chest tighten. I looked at Ethan. "How long have you had these?" "Since yesterday." "And you didn't call me?" I was trying to figure out what they meant. I pushed the phone back toward him. "They mean your fiancée and her father were discussing my property behind my back." Ethan looked down. But there was another message on the screen, one I hadn't noticed. It had been sent by Douglas to Claire 2 days before I signed the form. Once Robert signs, don't discuss the second document with Ethan. He doesn't need to know yet. I read it twice. Then I looked at my son. Second document. Ethan's face went pale. What second document? For the first time that night, I believed he genuinely didn't know. And suddenly, the form I'd signed wasn't the thing frightening me most. Because if Douglas Bennett had prepared a second document, I needed to know whose signature was on that one. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Ethan kept staring at the message on his phone. Don't discuss the second document with Ethan. He doesn't need to know yet. Finally, he looked at me. Dad, I swear I don't know what he's talking about. I wanted to believe him. But 5 months earlier, he'd stood in my workshop and watched me sign a document I hadn't read. Trust wasn't something I could hand him automatically anymore. "Show me everything Claire sent you," I said. Ethan pulled out a chair. For nearly an hour, we went through messages, emails, and attachments. Most looked harmless: house listings, mortgage estimates, conversations about their future. Then Ethan found an email Claire had forwarded to herself. The subject line was, "Hayes Redevelopment, Preliminary Structure." Attached was a document prepared by Douglas Bennett. I opened it. My workshop property was listed first. The neighboring lot was listed second. But farther down the page was something I hadn't expected: a proposed redevelopment plan. Douglas wasn't simply interested in buying my building. He wanted control of both properties because together they formed a large corner parcel near an area that developers had recently started targeting. Suddenly, Claire's questions from months earlier made sense. Did I own the building? Did I own the neighboring lot? Would Ethan eventually inherit the company? She hadn't been making conversation. She had been gathering information. I kept scrolling. Then I found the section referring to the second document. It appeared to be an authorization allowing someone to negotiate on behalf of an ownership entity connected to the property. At the bottom was a signature: Ethan Hayes. I turned the laptop toward my son. "Is that yours?" He stared at it. His face changed instantly. "No, look carefully. I don't need to." His voice was shaking now. "I never signed that." I studied him. "Then how is your signature there?" "I don't know." And then something seemed to hit him. Ethan grabbed his phone and started searching through old messages. "What are you looking for?" "The apartment application." "What apartment?" Before graduation, Claire and I thought about moving in together. She filled out most of the application. She asked me to sign a blank signature page because she said she'd attach it after finishing everything. My stomach dropped when he found a message. 6 days before he'd brought that blue folder into my workshop. I leaned back in my chair. There it was. I had signed something because I trusted my son. My son had signed something because he trusted Claire. And Claire had been sending information to her father. It looked obvious. Maybe too obvious. Then Ethan's phone rang. "Claire." He looked at me. "Answer it," I said. He put the call on speaker. "Ethan." Claire sounded breathless. "Where are you?" "At my dad's." Silence. Then, "Did he get a letter?" Ethan looked at me. Neither of us had told her about it. "How do you know about the letter?" he asked. Claire didn't answer. "Claire." When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. "You need to listen to me. My dad didn't tell me everything." I almost interrupted, but Ethan raised his hand. "What didn't he tell you?" "The workshop wasn't supposed to be taken from your father." "Then what was supposed to happen?" Another pause. "My dad said Robert would still own the business. He said he only needed temporary authority connected to the land so he could put together an investment proposal." I leaned toward the phone. "You used my son to get my signature." Claire went silent. Then she said quietly, "Yes." Ethan closed his eyes. I could see that answer break something inside him. But Claire wasn't finished. "Robert, I did something terrible. I know that. But 2 weeks ago, I found out my father changed the plan after you signed." "What did he change?" "He brought in another investor." "Who?" "I don't know the name. He wouldn't tell me." I looked back at the certified letter. "Carter and Wells Property Holdings." "Claire, does Carter and Wells mean anything to you?" The line went completely silent. Then I heard her whisper, "Oh no." "What?" "Robert, don't sign anything else. Don't agree to a meeting. Don't even call the number on that letter." "Why?" "Because Carter and Wells isn't buying your property." I waited. Claire took a shaky breath. "They're buying my father's interest in it." I looked around my kitchen, the room where Ethan had done homework as a kid, where I'd spent years opening invoices after he went to bed, trying to keep the business alive. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "What interest does Douglas Bennett have in property that belongs to me?" Claire answered so quietly I almost missed it. "The one your signature gave him." I didn't sleep that night. At 7 the next morning, instead of opening the workshop, I called the attorney who had handled my business paperwork for almost 15 years. Her name was Karen Mitchell. I told her I had received a letter involving my property and needed her to look at something immediately. She told me to bring everything: the certified letter, the screenshots, the document Ethan claimed he hadn't signed, and anything I remembered about the form I'd signed before graduation. An hour later, Ethan and I were sitting across from Karen in her office. She read quietly for almost 20 minutes. Then she removed her glasses. Rob, I need you to understand something before we go any further. My stomach tightened. Just tell me. The form you signed did not transfer ownership of her workshop. For the first time since opening that letter, I felt like I could breathe. Then Karen continued. But it may have granted limited authority over a proposed transaction involving the real estate. The relief disappeared. What does that mean? It means Douglas couldn't simply sell your building. But your signature appears to have authorized an entity he controlled to represent the property in negotiations connected to redevelopment. Ethan leaned forward. For how long? Karen looked down. According to this copy, 12 months. Hier. 12 months. She nodded. And there's another problem. Of course there was. She turned the document toward me and pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. The language was dense, but one phrase stood out. Exclusive negotiation rights. Karen explained that while the agreement was active, Douglas could claim the right to negotiate certain redevelopment opportunities involving my property. He didn't own my workshop, but he had created something valuable enough to sell to somebody else. Carter and Wells. I felt sick. So he sold them my signature? Not exactly, Karen said. He appears to be trying to assign his contractual interest to them. Ethan stood and walked toward the window. This is because of me. I looked at him. He couldn't face me. I brought you the form. Yes, you did. I told you not to worry about it. Yes. I should have read it. So should I. He finally turned around. There were tears in his eyes, but I wasn't ready to comfort him. Not yet, because loving your child doesn't erase what they did. And Ethan had betrayed my trust, even if someone else had manipulated him first. Karen interrupted us. There's something else I need to ask. She held up the document bearing Ethan's signature. Ethan, you're absolutely certain you didn't sign this? Absolutely. Then we may be dealing with a falsified document. Ethan told her about the blank signature page he'd given Claire for the apartment application. Karen wrote everything down. Then she asked, do you still have the original apartment paperwork? Ethan thought for a moment. Maybe in my email. He searched. Nothing. Then he remembered Claire had used her laptop to submit the application. Karen told him not to contact Douglas. She wanted copies of every message first. We were gathering our things when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Karen stopped me. Answer it. Don't agree to anything. I put the call on speaker. A man's voice came through. Mr. Hayes? Yes. My name is Martin Wells. I'm calling regarding the redevelopment agreement involving your property. Karen immediately started taking notes. What do you want? There was a pause. Then Wells said something I wasn't expecting. I think you and I may have been given different versions of the same story. I looked at Karen. What story were you given? That you were retiring. My hand tightened around the phone. I'm not retiring. Another pause. And that your son had already agreed to sell Hayes Custom Woodworks after graduation. Ethan spun around. What? Wells heard him. Is Ethan Hayes there? Yes. Then both of you need to see what Douglas Bennett sent us. Karen leaned closer. What exactly did he send? Wells answered. A signed statement from Ethan saying his father was no longer capable of managing the business and that the family wanted the property sold before its value declined. The room went completely still. I looked at my son. He looked like he'd been punched. Then Wells added one final detail. The statement is dated 4 days after graduation. Ethan slowly shook his head. Dad, I wasn't even in Ohio 4 days after graduation. I remembered immediately. He had left the morning after graduation for a week-long trip with 3 college friends. And suddenly, for the first time since that letter arrived, we had something stronger than suspicion. We had a date. And if Ethan could prove where he'd been when that statement was supposedly signed, Douglas Bennett's entire plan might finally start falling apart. Ethan proved it in less than 10 minutes. He still had the airline confirmation, the hotel receipt, photos with timestamps, even a credit card charge from a restaurant hundreds of miles away on the exact date Douglas claimed Ethan had signed that statement in Ohio. Karen looked through everything. This doesn't automatically solve the problem, she said, but it gives us something concrete. Then she called Martin Wells back. This time, the conversation lasted almost 40 minutes. What we learned changed the entire picture. Carter and Wells hadn't approached Douglas. Douglas had approached them. He presented my workshop and neighboring lot as the center of a future commercial redevelopment project. According to Martin, Douglas claimed the Hayes family had already decided to exit the woodworking business after Ethan's graduation. He had shown them my signed authorization, étanes disputé de signature, and a statement claiming I was stepping away. Together, those documents made the deal look legitimate. But Douglas had made one mistake. He had become impatient. Carter and Wells had asked for additional verification before moving forward. Instead of providing it, Douglas pressured them to complete the assignment quickly. That made Martin suspicious, and that was why the certified letter had been sent directly to me. Not because the deal was finished, because Martin wanted confirmation. The letter I'd been terrified to receive might have been the very thing that saved my business. But one question still bothered me. Claire. She had admitted helping her father get my signature. She had asked questions about my property. She had known Douglas wanted control over negotiations. How much had she really known? Ethan wanted to call her. Karen advised against discussing details until she had preserved the messages we already had. So we waited. That evening, I went to the workshop alone. I walked past the old workbench I'd built during Ethan's first year of high school. There were still pencil marks on one corner where I'd measured his height when he was 14. I remembered him standing there, laughing because he'd finally gotten taller than me. That was the hardest part. Douglas Bennett hadn't targeted some random property. He had found the one thing in my life tied to almost every memory I had of raising my son. And Ethan had unknowingly opened the door for him. Around 8 that evening, I heard someone knocking on the front glass. Claire. I almost didn't let her in. She stood outside holding the same blue folder Ethan had carried into my workshop 5 months earlier. I unlocked the door. Where did you get that? My father's office. You went there? She nodded. He doesn't know I took it. She placed a folder on my workbench. I lied to you, Robert. I already know that. No, you don't know all of it. Ethan arrived about 15 minutes later after Claire finally agreed to call him. The moment he saw her, his expression hardened. You used me. Claire looked at him. Yes. No excuses. No immediate apology. Just yes. She admitted that Douglas had convinced her the property could become far more valuable through redevelopment. He told her that if Ethan eventually inherited the business anyway, there was no real harm in getting the process started early. And you believe that? I asked. I wanted to. That answer told me more than an excuse would have. Claire had imagined a future with Ethan. A nicer house. Financial security. A valuable property deal. And she convinced herself that because Ethan might someday inherit what I'd built, using my trust wasn't really stealing anything from me. But I was still alive, still working, still the owner. And nobody had bothered to ask what I wanted. Claire pushed the folder toward me. My father told me you would never understand the opportunity. He said people like you get emotionally attached to businesses and don't know when to let go. People like me? Her eyes dropped. Those were his words. I opened the folder. Inside were copies of the documents we'd already seen. Then I found something new. A handwritten page. Numbers. Dates. Property estimates. And beside my workshop address, Douglas had written, Phase 1. Secure authorization through EH. Ethan saw it too. His face tightened. But farther down the page was another line. Phase 2. CB removed after transfer. Claire froze. What does CB mean? Ethan asked. Claire didn't answer. I looked at her. Claire Bennett. She slowly nodded. Her father had planned to use her too. But that wasn't the biggest surprise inside the folder. Behind the handwritten page was an email printout. Douglas had been discussing my property long before Claire ever started dating Ethan. The earliest email was dated almost 2 years earlier. Ethan and Claire had only been together 14 months. I looked at Claire. If this email is real, your father knew about my property before you knew my son. Claire stared at the date. All the color disappeared from her face. Then she whispered, That can't be right. But it was. And suddenly, I had to consider a possibility none of us had wanted to imagine. Maybe Douglas Bennett hadn't discovered my property because his daughter fell in love with my son. Maybe his daughter had met my son because Douglas Bennett already knew exactly who we were. Claire read the email again, then a third time. Her hands were trembling. This was sent almost 8 months before I met Ethan. I looked at her. How did you meet him? At a career networking event at school. Ethan nodded. She came over and introduced herself. Claire's expression changed. My father told me to attend that event. The workshop went quiet. She pulled out her phone and started searching through old messages. It took several minutes. Then she found one. A message from Douglas sent the morning of that networking event. You should introduce yourself to Ethan Hayes. His family owns a manufacturing property near the Easton Redevelopment Corridor. Could be a useful connection after graduation. Ethan read it over her shoulder, then stepped away. So you knew who I was? Claire's eyes filled. I knew your father owned a business. I didn't know about any plan, but you approached me because your dad told you to. At first, yes. Ethan laughed once, but there was no humor in it. 14 months, Claire. I know. You met my friends. You came to my house. You sat across from my dad at dinner. I know. And every time you asked about the workshop, I was giving my father information. That confession hurt Ethan differently than anything else had. He sat down on the same upside-down bucket he'd used as a kid whenever he visited my shop. For a moment, he looked 12 years old again. Then he asked her, was any of it real? Claire didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, it became real. Ethan looked away. I understood what she meant, but I also understood why that answer wasn't enough. Maybe Claire had genuinely fallen in love with my son, but their relationship had started with a purpose Ethan never knew about. You can't build trust on a foundation one person wasn't allowed to see. Claire wiped her eyes and pointed toward Douglas's email. My father has been following redevelopment plans around this area for years. He must have noticed your property because of its location. That made sense. My workshop and neighboring lots sat near a section of the city that had changed dramatically over the past few years. New offices, new apartments, new retail projects. I had seen construction happening around me. I just hadn't realized someone might look at my workshop and see something worth manipulating a family over. Then Karen called. I put her on speaker. I've reviewed the documents Martin Wells sent, she said. Rob, Douglas has a bigger problem than we thought. What did you find? The authorization you signed references an attached disclosure. I don't remember a disclosure. That's because the copy Martin received includes one, but the copy Claire brought you doesn't. I looked at the blue folder. What does that mean? It means we may have two versions of the same agreement. Ethan stood. One Dad saw and one Douglas sent. Possibly. Karen continued. The disclosure in Martin's version claims you acknowledged the redevelopment plan and understood Douglas could assign his contractual interest to another company. I never saw that. That's exactly why this matters. And Rob, I also had our document examiner take a closer look at both signatures carrying Ethan's name. The stroke patterns match each other almost exactly, but neither matches Ethan's actual signature. That tells me Douglas didn't forge two separate signatures. He lifted one, the blank page Ethan signed for the apartment application, and reused the image on both documents. The authorization and the statement Martin described are two different documents, but they carry the same forged signature. Ethan went pale. So, the page I signed for our apartment application is the reason my name is on all of it. That's my read of it, yes, Karen said, which actually helps you. One traceable source is easier to prove than two mysteries. For the first time, I felt something stronger than fear. Anger. Not wild anger. The kind that makes everything suddenly clear. I had made a mistake by signing something without reading it. Ethan had made a mistake by trusting Claire. Claire had made choices she couldn't excuse by blaming her father. But Douglas had apparently taken every one of those mistakes and tried to turn them into a business opportunity. Karen told us not to alter anything in the blue folder. She wanted it preserved exactly as Claire had found it. Before hanging up, she added, and Rob, Martin Wells has suspended every discussion involving your property until this is resolved. That was the first genuinely good news I'd heard. My workshop wasn't gone. My property hadn't been sold. Douglas's plan had stopped moving. At least for now. Claire suddenly sat down. There might be something else. Ethan looked at her. What now? My father keeps backups of important files on external drive. He doesn't trust cloud storage for everything. Where? in a locked cabinet in his office. I shook my head. Don't go back there. We handle this properly now. Claire nodded, and that was when Ethan surprised me. He walked over to the workbench and picked up the original certified letter. Then he looked at me. Dad, I need to say something before this goes any further. I waited. You trusted me because I'm your son. I used that trust to get your signature without understanding what I was asking you to sign. His voice cracked. Claire's father may have planned this. Claire may have lied to me, but I still lied to you. I didn't interrupt. I told you it was routine because I knew if I explained that Claire's father was involved, you'd probably read it. That hurt, because it was true. Ethan looked directly at me. I wasn't trying to take your business, but I betrayed you anyway. For months, I'd imagined what I would say if my son ever admitted that. But standing there, I realized I didn't want revenge. I wanted my son to understand what trust actually costs. So I told him, I can forgive a mistake, Ethan, but trust doesn't come back because somebody says they're sorry. He nodded. I know. You rebuild it. I will. Claire stood several feet away. And what about me? Ethan looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I don't know if there's still in us to rebuild. Claire lowered her eyes. The following morning, Karen called again. This time, her voice was different. Rob, Douglas Bennett contacted my office. What does he want? To settle this privately. I almost laughed. Now he wants to talk. He's offering to terminate the agreement and surrender any claimed rights involving your property. That sounded too easy. What does he want in return? Karen paused. He wants all three of you, especially Claire, to stop looking into how he obtained the documents. I looked through the workshop window at the building I'd spent nearly 30 years creating. Douglas wasn't afraid of losing the deal anymore. He was afraid of us discovering something. And whatever it was, it had to be bigger than my workshop. Karen's advice was simple. Don't accept anything yet. Douglas Bennett was offering to walk away from the agreement, surrender his claimed negotiation rights, and leave my property alone. A week earlier, I might have signed that deal immediately. But now I understood what a dangerous sentence just sign here could become. So I told Karen, I don't sign anything until you read it. For the first time in days, Ethan almost smiled. Good rule. I looked at him. Little late, but yes. Karen requested that Douglas provide a complete record of every document and communication related to my property before we discussed any settlement. His attorney resisted. Then Martin Wells provided something that changed everything. When Douglas first approached Carter and Wells, he'd sent them a package describing the proposed redevelopment opportunity. Buried in that package was an earlier draft of my authorization agreement. Karen compared it with the copy from Claire's blue folder and the version Douglas had eventually sent to Carter and Wells. 3 versions. The earliest draft contained no disclosure giving Douglas permission to assign his interest. The copy Claire had taken from his office didn't contain it either. But the version sent to Carter and Wells did. And the formatting around the additional paragraph didn't perfectly match the rest of the document. Karen wouldn't make accusations without a proper examination, but she didn't need to explain what that difference could mean. Douglas's entire position depended on proving that I'd knowingly agreed to language I was certain I'd never seen. Then Martin sent one more file, an email from Douglas. It had been written shortly after I signed the form. Robert signed the base authorization. We can finalize the investor language now. I read that sentence until the words stopped feeling real. The base authorization, then finalize the investor language. Even I understood the order. My signature had come first. At least some of the language Douglas wanted to rely on appeared to have come later. Ethan sat beside me in Karen's office with his hands clasped together. He planned to change it after Dad signed. Karen answered carefully. This email raises very serious questions about what was added, when it was added, and what Rob actually agreed to. That's why nobody should destroy, alter, or privately exchange any records. Then she looked at Claire. Your father asked specifically that you stop looking into his files. Do you know why? Claire was silent. Finally, she said, I think I do. She explained that years earlier, Douglas had operated a small property consulting firm with another partner. His business had struggled. Then, over the previous 2 years, Douglas had started chasing redevelopment opportunities aggressively. He wasn't secretly wealthy. He was under pressure, and according to Claire, he had spent months telling her that one major deal could fix everything. My property was supposed to be that deal. Not because Douglas hated me. Not because he had some decades-old connection to my family. The truth was uglier because it was simpler. He saw something I'd spent 30 years building, and decided my trust was cheaper than buying it honestly. Claire started crying. I helped him. Ethan looked at her, but said nothing. I didn't know he would change documents, she continued. But I asked Robert those questions. I approached Ethan because Dad told me to. I convinced Ethan the form wasn't a big deal. She turned toward me. You trusted me in your home, and I used that. I appreciated that she wasn't asking me to excuse it. I can't tell you what Ethan should do about your relationship, I said. That's between you and him. Then I looked at my son. But neither of you gets to call this just your father's mistake. Claire nodded. I know. Later that afternoon, Douglas finally agreed to a formal meeting through the attorneys. I expected someone arrogant. Instead, when he walked into the conference room, he looked tired. He sat across from me, but barely looked in my direction. His attorney did most of the talking. Douglas was prepared to withdraw every claimed right under the authorization. Carter and Wells had already suspended the proposed transaction. The disputed documents will be preserved for review. Any further questions about the signatures or altered language would be handled through the appropriate legal process. Then Douglas finally spoke. Rob, you keep the property. Nothing was sold. I stared at him. You think that's what this is about? What else would it be about? I thought about that little rented garage. Ethan sitting on an upside-down bucket. The nights I'd worked after putting him to bed. The years it took before I could afford the building Douglas had reduced to numbers on a page. You looked at 30 years of my life and saw a parcel. Douglas said nothing. You looked at your daughter and saw access to my son. Claire lowered her head. And you looked at my son's trust in me and decided it was a shortcut. Douglas finally met my eyes. I made business decisions. No, I shook my head. You made decisions about my family. That was the only thing I needed to say to him. When the meeting ended, Karen stayed behind to finish the paperwork with the attorneys. Ethan and I walked outside together. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan said, Claire gave me the ring back. I stopped. You ended the engagement? He nodded. I don't know what happens later. But I can't marry someone while I'm still trying to figure out which parts of our relationship were real. I understood. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. I'm not taking over Hayes Custom Woodworks. I looked at him. Who said you were? You always did. Someday. If you wanted it. He shook his head. That's the problem. I think I started treating someday like it already belonged to me. That sentence stayed with me. Maybe Douglas had exploited my son's trust. Maybe Claire had manipulated him. But somewhere along the way, Ethan had also started thinking of my life's work as his future property instead of my present life. And he finally understood the difference. We drove back to the workshop. Before leaving, Ethan stopped beside the workbench. Dad, yeah. Can I come in Saturday? For what? He glanced around the shop. Work. I studied him. He wasn't asking for the company. He wasn't asking me to forgive him. He was asking for a place to start. 7 o'clock, I said. Ethan nodded. I'll be here. Saturday morning, I arrived at 6:45. At 6:50, Ethan was already waiting outside. No folder. No paperwork. Just work gloves. And for the first time since that certified letter arrived, I unlocked the workshop door without wondering what my son wanted from me. But forgiveness wasn't the ending of our story, because there was still one document left to sign. This time it would be mine, and I intended to read every single word. 3 months later, I sat in Karen Mitchell's office with another document in front of me. This time, nobody handed me a pen. Nobody pointed to a yellow tab. And nobody said, it's just routine. I read every page. Twice. By then, the agreement I'd signed before Ethan's graduation had been formally terminated. Douglas no longer claimed any negotiation rights involving my property, and Carter and Wells had ended all discussions connected to his proposal. The disputed documents and forged signatures were left with the attorneys, who confirmed enough evidence. The traced signature page, the mismatched formatting, the time-stamped alibi, to refer the matter for the appropriate legal process. I didn't need to know every consequence Douglas might eventually face. I only needed to know one thing. He could no longer make decisions about what I'd built. The document sitting in front of me now was different. It was part of a new estate and business succession plan Karen had prepared at my request. For years, I'd casually told Ethan, "Someday, this will all be yours." I thought that was love, but I'd finally realized something. Giving your child a future shouldn't mean teaching them that your present already belongs to them. So the new plan was clear. While I was alive and capable of running Hayes Custom Woodworks, control stayed with me. If Ethan wanted a future in the company, he could earn responsibility gradually. Not because I stopped loving him, because I wanted him to understand what responsibility actually meant. Karen tapped the final page. "Any questions?" I smiled. "About 12. She laughed, and we went through every one of them. Then I signed. That signature felt different. Not because the document mattered less, because this time I understood exactly what my name meant at the bottom of the page. Ethan had been coming to the workshop every Saturday. At first, things were awkward. We talked about orders, measurements, customers, anything except what had happened. But trust doesn't usually return in one dramatic conversation. It comes back quietly. Someone says they'll arrive at 7, and they're there at 6:50. Someone makes a mistake and tells you before you discover it. Someone asks instead of assuming. Week after week, Ethan kept showing up. One Saturday afternoon, we were repairing an old walnut table when he suddenly said, "Dad, Claire called me." I stopped sanding. "How is she?" "She moved out of her father's house." I waited. She apologized again. She said she's trying to build a life that doesn't depend on him. "And you?" Ethan stared at the table. "I forgave her." I nodded. Then he added, "But we're not getting back together." I looked at him. I can forgive what she did without pretending it didn't change things. That sounded like something he'd learned the hard way. Maybe we both had. A few weeks later, Ethan brought his college diploma to the workshop. I thought he wanted me to hang it in my office. Instead, he placed it on the old workbench. "Remember this?" I did. That was the same workbench where he'd sat as a kid asking why I worked so much. I remember. He smiled. "You told me you worked, so I'd have choices." I nodded. "I think I finally understand what you meant." "What do you think I meant?" "That you were building opportunities for me." He looked around the workshop. "Not an entitlement." I couldn't answer immediately, because for months, I'd been waiting for some perfect apology that would make everything feel normal again. That sentence came closer than any apology could. I put down my tools. "Ethan, come here." He stepped toward me. I hugged my son. Not because everything was forgotten. It wasn't. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. I hugged him because the 22-year-old standing in front of me finally understood something the boy on that upside-down bucket couldn't have understood. What we inherit from our parents isn't just property. It's trust. And trust has to be protected long before anything has your name on it. Almost a year has passed since Ethan walked into my workshop with that blue folder. The building is still mine. The neighboring lot is still mine. Hayes Custom Woodworks is still open. And Ethan? He works somewhere else during the week now. A job he found himself. But most Saturday mornings, around 6:50, I still see his car pull into the parking lot. I never asked him to keep coming. He just does. Sometimes we work. Sometimes we argue. Sometimes we get lunch and talk about everything except business. We're not the father and son we were before that signature. I used to think that was the tragedy. Now I'm not so sure, because the relationship we had before was built partly on assumptions. The relationship we're building now is based on choices. His choice to show up. My choice to give him another chance. And both of our choice to never confuse love with blind trust again. There's one more thing. I keep the original certified letter in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not because I enjoy remembering what happened. I keep it beside a copy of the new agreement I signed in Karen's office. 2 documents. 2 signatures. One I gave away without reading because I trusted someone I loved. And one I signed only after understanding every word. Whenever I see them together, I'm reminded of something I wish I'd understood 30 years earlier. Betrayal doesn't always come from someone who wants to destroy you. Sometimes it comes from someone you love making a selfish choice, and someone else realizing they can use that choice against you. Ethan betrayed my trust. Claire betrayed his. Douglas tried to turn both betrayals into an opportunity. But none of them got to decide how my story ended. I did. My son once asked me to sign a form without reading it. I nearly let one signature put 30 years of work into somebody else's hands. But the most important thing I rebuilt afterward wasn't my business. It was the trust between a father and his son. And this time, we're building it slowly enough to make sure it lasts.